Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 334 of the podcast. It's February 28th, 2019. And joining me today, all the way from Australia, is Barry McCarthy. Barry spent more than 15 years in leadership roles with Toyota in Australia and now works as an associate with the consulting firm Honsha. We were able to spend a lot of time talking when I participated late last year in Honsha's executive development mission trip to Japan. One thing we talked about quite a bit was Barry's experience with Toyota being what he calls a development company, as I blogged about late last year, and there's other blog posts about the Honsha trip. You can find links to all of that by going to leanblog.org/334. In our discussion, Barry talks about why he was skeptical about lean before he joined Toyota, but he evolved as Toyota continues to change and evolve. So why is Barry afraid that lean outside of Toyota might get stuck in the past? We'll talk about all of that, people development, what it means to be a development company, and more. Barry, hi. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Mark. Thanks for the invitation. I've been looking forward to speaking again after our trip to Japan where we met.
Likewise. Yeah, I'm excited that we can do this, that we can have further conversation, that we can share that with the listeners. But as far as introductions go, first off, where are you dialing in from? People may be picking up on an accent, and if you can talk about some of your work history before Toyota, how you ended up at Toyota, and then it's turned out there's an after Toyota. If you can give us kind of the summary before we dig into details.
Sure can. It's in Melbourne at the moment. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning, thereabouts. We started. So it's early in the morning in Melbourne. The weather's hot at this time of year. Now, I took a while, Mark, to get to where I am today. I started out in civil engineering, and then I moved into line management in a plant bakery. If you can imagine a continuous flow of bread products. I spent 12 years there in different roles. About 9 years into my time, I was introduced to Toyota thinking. And I must say, as a line manager, I was very skeptical of the claims of what Lean and Visual Workplace, which was the version we called it, could deliver to the business. Never had I the wildest or remotest ambition or thought of ever working for Toyota. But how things would work out and change, you just never know, do you? In the last 2 years at the bakery, I was managing a learning and development project, and that was linked to the Australian qualification framework. It was a workplace competency-based training program, and it was sponsored by the government. And the program we were running included transport, logistics, sales, packaging, plant baking, and the target audience was around 500 workers. The team I was working with there were quite creative, and our implementation at the time gained quite a bit of recognition. This was when Toyota approached, that was Toyota in Australia, and they wanted to come and benchmark our program. Did I get some mileage with the CI team on that one? Mm-hmm. At the time, I was oblivious to the problem that Toyota was having in Australia, which was that they had a training system in place long before the national training program, and they were struggling to integrate it with the new framework. They came, had a look around, and this ended up in a job offer, and that was around 2003. My curiosity got the better of me, and I accepted and moved into Toyota. I must say that it was a roller coaster ride from there. Trips to Japan to understand their expectations and the opportunities to see and assess ideal situations regarding training and development kept coming and coming. So anyway, the implementation went well, and with the program integrated into the fundamental skills program, we ended up getting about 1,600 team members through it over time. I then went on to work on the integration of supervisor management training and development, what Toyota calls floor management development system. Then also this led me into transitioning to talent management, the Toyota Institute in Australia. And this was where I was exposed to more of the global content like the Toyota Way, Toyota business practices, TVP problem solving as it's known, on-job development, policy deployment through Honsha and Canry. And in 2013, then I moved into manufacturing organisational planning and development, which was a big name, but the division basically housed the TPS office, which I spent some time working with engineering, logistics and the development systems there. When automotive closed and the announcement was made, our role moved to supporting the quality and the last car being our best car. But at the same time, we had to transition our employees into the future to maintain the motivation and also prepare them for their futures outside of the business. And this was done through an upskilling program, which I was part of. There was another program for placement and training for your new skill, which was also implemented at the same time. Now, this upskilling, we worked very much on how to convert their tacit knowledge or practical wisdom into a context for their future potential work environments, because a lot of Toyota people don't know what they know, and they definitely don't know how to always put it into words. So I'm not quite sure, how to go into all the reasons for closure. They were complex, and I'm probably not the right person to talk about those. So once the direction was given, we all had to reconsider our future plans. So we're better to start, for me personally, than with an A3. And the outcome the A3 delivered, I would call a very smooth and low-stress transition for me personally. Probably, I loved working most definitely at Toyota. It was a challenge, and it was a challenge I needed at the time. Leaving in 2017 was right timing for the next challenge. What am I doing now? Over the last year and a bit, I've been continuing my executive duties with the Association of Manufacturing Excellence in Australia. I also enjoy joining Honsha on their Japanese executive study missions. I call myself an explicador. Doing some explaining is probably my role. And I also work with a couple of companies that Honsha support in the US, and I have some organisations that in Australia and Japan that I advise privately as well. So that's about me.
Yeah, well, now we'll get to dig into the next layer on all of that. And one thing I was going to ask as a follow up. I mean, you said suggested that you don't know, might not be the right one to speak to all the reasons why the plants were closed, but to set context for people who don't know or haven't followed what's happening in the Australian auto industry, the entire industry stopped producing in Australia, not just Toyota, correct?
Correct. And Australia is a very small market, and it's sometimes used as a testing ground. So if you look at Toyota, they used Australia very much to help them understand the Western culture, and that allowed them to then move into NUMI and Kentucky and have the right, I suppose, mindset around relations with employees in the West. And so they used it very strongly to learn. And I think that's still a feature that Australia has. It's well out of the way. It's a Western country close to Asia. You can do things down in Australia and it doesn't affect your global business. It seems to be a good testing ground. And so I think that's the big learning out of for Toyota in Australia.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about, going back to when you were working, for the bakery in that company, when you mentioned being skeptical about lean at first. I mean, this is not at all uncommon. It might sound too good to be true, or it's just different than a lot of organizations operate. What was behind some of the skepticism? Can you talk more about that?
Well, to give you a little bit of context, when I was working for this large Australian company, before going to Toyota, I was very skeptical, and it was around year 2000, and I was a line manager in a plant, and I just delivered around $22,000 a week in cost savings. And I have to admit it was delivered through hard work and not by good organising. I was in my boss's office not long after achieving the target, and he said to me, your target for next year is a cost reduction of $30,000 a week. And, I suppose who hasn't had that kind of experience? I was lost for words, and I said to him, that's totally out of my capability. Where did that number come from? And he said, no particular place, was his response. And, I said, what are your ideas on how I should find that sort of savings? And he said, well, it's not my problem. That's what you get paid for. Was his comeback, And so I was in a really good state of mind, but a couple of weeks later, after the bruising had gone down from me banging my head on my desk after the meeting, I get a call from him saying the company had organised a training session, and it was at a hotel at Melbourne Airport so that managers could fly in from around the country. And they had some consultants who they said had worked with Toyota in South Africa, and they were going to talk to us for a couple of days on this concept of visual workplace. Now, my boss informed me that, listen well, take good notes, because the target was now $35,000 a week after the training.
Yeah.
And so there's no such thing as a free lunch in there. These consultants, I suppose, introduced the program, their visual workplace, and it was all lecture-based. And we started with 5S and having people going around cleaning things. Well, we were in the food manufacturing, so it wasn't actually a messy place like some of the photos of the machines shops they were showing us. And my thoughts were really fixed on, allocating more time to cleaning is not going to take a chunk out of my weekly target. And then they went on to visualising charts, assessments of posture, collecting data, team meetings. And I had all the same feelings that most people get. This is just extra work for me, and in my head, costs were going through the roof in the opposite direction to where I needed them. Look, I have to admit, I had ego issues as well. I had a mindset of, I know my job and I know it better than any of these guys. And, you can be a little bit overconfident. I was very set in my paradigm. But I also could, not see how, these targets could be achieved by what they were talking about. And yes, I felt the targets were far from realistic, though I also understood the economic drivers of the supermarkets and how bloody minded they can be about price. And so at this point, I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't have the support of a good organising and development system behind me, as the organisation didn't have it. And whenever I go to talk to people about organising or lean, I always place that sceptical me, so to speak, in the audience. Mm-hmm. And I find it just keeps me honest, and I lose some of, I suppose, the heavy-handedness you can have with when you have ideas, and it keeps that humility into context. Because, lean is not an easy concept to grasp. We have to respect that. Everyone takes their own time to build their own understanding, and we have to find better ways to help them take advantages of what lean can offer.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned arrogance. I mean, that can happen on both sides of the equation. If you're on the client side, I know my work, I don't have anything to learn. Who are you to tell me I can do better? And it can also, unfortunately, be on the consultant side, with the consultant saying, "Oh, I've got experience, I've got all the answers," and that's probably set up for a combative, poor relationship and poor results. I think it's interesting. Toyota emphasizes so much the idea of leading with humility. I hope if I have moments as a writer or a consultant, or if I'm coming across as arrogant, I hope friends would call me on it, because that doesn't really help invite others to learn. When someone's so strident and I've got something for you, it could be correct and good and helpful, but people often react, I think, in very understandable ways that doesn't lead to progress, right?
Yeah, it's kind of this concept of appreciative listening, really being open and listening to the other side and taking in and absorbing what's going on. We tend to jump, like you said, to our positions and our set beliefs very quickly.
No, I mean, I don't know what kind of stories you heard within Toyota, if this is a fair question, but there I've only read about Taiichi Ono, and there was a lot of brilliance there, but there's also a lot of stories where it sounds like he was sort of, for lack of a better word, rubbing people's faces in it of how bad they were and how much waste there were, and I don't know if that's just in how the stories are told, but I've heard others kind of make the joke about. People who've worked with him saying, "Oh, he's Mr. Oh no," as in, "Oh no, he's coming." I'm curious, like, what's the lore within Toyota about that approach to pointing out opportunities and sort of driving people to perform better?
I think it's an interesting one to study because you have to understand, I think, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, that Toyota is really good at managing paradox and keeping it open and live. Now, what we tend to do in the West is we want an answer one way or another. So, we would take, well, do we want a hard line or do we want a soft line? And E.G. Toyota, as I understand it, was really good at balancing, say, the hardliners within the organisation and the soft liners within the organisation. Now, probably around the 1990s, it started to swing more towards the soft line approach, the HRD approach to it, and more around the quality circles, the engagement of the workforce. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it because it's a paradox, it's open and it can swing, so it moves. Though I do think there's more of a HRD line. Now, so the stories I've heard is that, Ono probably knew when to, back off and allow the softer line to come through. He was tolerant of it. He certainly didn't, push back on it as such. But what E.G. Toyota did was allow both and everybody's viewpoints to come to the table. So, yeah, I take it with caution these days. And we've got to be a little bit careful that we don't get stuck in the past. Toyota is constantly moving and changing, and we don't want to refer to how it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. And the times were different. The environment was different. The workplace was different then. There are a lot of things we won't tolerate in the workplace these days that was tolerated then.
Yeah. And I imagine, as histories are told and stories are written, either, things get exaggerated or the most interesting moments get captured that don't paint a full picture of the person and their approach.
Well, the other thing too is I think there's a risk that lean could become stuck in a time frame or become a little bit cultish. I see a lot of Onoism on the talk groups, but I think you've got to balance that. And also sometimes Ono was representative of, the Toyota manager, probably though he was very different to the leader of the business at that time, who was E.G. Toyota. And you've got to give a lot more, I suppose, bandwidth and space to E.G. and what he did in the company and some of the other people who really shaped the company as well. A lot of what Ono's credited for probably came from the people around him as well. Toyota's a very, I suppose, democratic, involved sort of company. So, and it's easy to tag a saying or something to a particular person.
So I want to come back to skepticism about lean. I think it's interesting that you say this is a good thing. I think remembering, the skeptical me, I think, as you put it, when you're working with or teaching people who are new to lean. And, we end up talking about this a lot on the podcast, the idea of in healthcare, people are quick to point out, well, hospitals are different than factories. I'm like, well, of course they are. Patients are not cars. Well, of course not. I know people in the aerospace industry who kind of turn their nose up or they're skeptical and say, well, planes are far more complicated than cars. Man, how do you help people get past that? Or how do you engage people into seeing the potential for how lean fits to get past some of that skepticism?
Well, it's interesting. Last year, Toyota totally reorganized its structure, and it moved TPS out of manufacturing. And so they really want to send a message that it's not just in manufacturing. And as they move more towards a data and mobility company, you will see more of a focus of applying TPS into these new parts of the business. It was always a belief that the best gains for a business were not actually in the manufacturing area, they were in the support areas when it came to TPS. And a lot of our time was spent in those areas. To truly design a lean thinking for the future, I really encourage people to go back and get a true understanding of the philosophy that it's built on. And many lean versions do not seem to account for what we've just spoken about, that paradox and the balancing. And they have they try to eliminate the tension rather than to actually allow that tension to play itself out and to try and balance it. So I suppose having come out of Toyota a year ago, I can't classify myself as very new to lean. And I say that seriously as I'm trying to define what lean is. My current definition would be that lean is a metaphor or an interpretation of how Toyota organises and develops its people and its business activities. Now, as an interpretation, I see many variations as I see people consulting in it. So that part is a little bit hard to put a clear finger on. The reason for this, though, is that Toyota is all the time moving and it's changing. And people are leaving and having different experiences in Toyota and taking different messages out there. It's very emergent. And what you've got to realise too is that as a development person in Toyota, I was not always looking to give all of the knowledge to the manufacturing person. It's too much knowledge around it. So you have to kind of, section out what you give to the different areas. So you can never, as a person coming out of manufacturing, have a full picture of what Toyota's about. If you come out of a purchasing or a sales area, you don't understand, how much information and theory behind what's being implemented. So you get all of these different viewpoints. If you merge them all together, you get the best image, I suppose. But if we go back and regard lean as a metaphor, and I can really understand also the difficulty people have connecting with it. And if I explain it this way, in thinking about how Toyota organises its business, the words that come to mind post-2001 are different to the ones that came before it. In 2001, with the Toyota Way, we start to see a lot more about respect for humanity, teamwork, Kaizen, practical wisdom, contribution to society, continuous improvement. Excuse me. I don't easily associate these words with lean. Now, lean never really moved as a metaphor with the way Toyota is moving is one way that I probably see it. And really, when I look at those words and I put them there out in front of me, I probably, the last thing that comes to my word is a metaphor, lean. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't really connect for me. And so I think we need to start to build new understandings around that if we want to move forward. Otherwise, we will lose more and more people and it will become more difficult. Now, looking at a Japanese Toyota production line, as you and I stood over on the gantry up there last year, I can understand how people can be drawn to a conclusion that it was lean. The level of waste removal on that line was extreme. And, if you were sitting up there, and I remember initially when I went into one of those plants, for the first 9 days, I was just in awe. I thought it was a machine. I had no doubt. And initially when I moved into Toyota, I tried to understand lean as a machine. And so, a cold Cartesian Newtonian tool-based machine image is a possible metaphor. But as I got more exposed to it, I thought I need a more innovative way of thinking about this. I moved to thinking of it as a system or an organism with boundaries and feedback and improvement in some ways. But there are more models of systems thinking than there are minutes in the day. So again, the biological neo-Darwinism excludes much of the emergent activity I observe when I stand back and look at a Toyota production system. So my current metaphor, what happens in Toyota, is more biosocial. So this allows us a playground to think in where we can use the words such as dialogue. Instead of systems, we can use relationships. Instead of feedback, we can use back talk. It allows us access to a whole lot of other theories on developmental theory, routine, process, and pattern theories. And then we can engage more confidently with uncertainty and the emergent. Biosocial is a far better match for humanity and practical wisdom aspects that Toyota put out there than lean. So I know this is difficult for people to move away from lean, but I think we need to start to put a more biosocial metaphor out there that universalizes respect for humanity, contribution to society. And then we'll have a more relevant language to engage any business or organisation, because, then if we start to talk about what we call currently a tool like A3 and convert this model into this biosocial thinking, then what we find is this tool becomes a actual dialogue. And then rather than filling in a form, with a dialogue mindset, it really pushes the idea of having engagement with people. And the manager gets more and looks for more. If we look at what they call the Nemawashi log, now that's a paper that sits behind the A3 that never really gets shown, but I call it like an integration log. And it's a list of people and their viewpoints on the problem. Now, by looking at this, I can ask the owner of the paper, who may be my direct report, or they're presenting the paper to me, what did so-and-so think in finance, How did you integrate their thoughts into the paper? If not, why not? I'm starting to have a dialogue here to flesh out with them all of the different viewpoints. I can say, I don't see any comments from purchasing. Have you actually gone out and sought their input? The secrets of these so-called tools, they're all about patterns of dialogue they create and how they engage people. So I think if we can start to view them not so much as tools but as a dialogue mindset, we'll be able to talk to people more broadly in the different areas that we go and try and explain the real strength and power of these lean systems.
Yeah. And just jumping in, just a real detailed follow-up for people who don't know the word Nemawashi. Is it fair to say that, the way I was taught, it's the idea of you're laying a foundation, you're building support. That's the dialogue that you're talking about on that sheet of paper, those conversations with different stakeholders. Yeah.
And, if I'm reviewing someone's paper, I like to see that they've spoken to lots of people. And I want to see that they're engaging in the viewpoints that those people are offering. If I see they've engaged a lot of people and they haven't taken on board any of the ideas that they put forward, and I don't see those in the paper, then I get a bit worried that it's a bit closed and they're thinking it's closed and they're not going to get the best solution. So the real value in the A3 is some of the papers and the activities that people do behind it.
Yeah. You use the word tool. the A3 could be a very prescriptive template. And I've seen some organizations where it's really just a matter of people roll their eyes. And so I got to fill out the form. And the spirit of it, or maybe what you were saying, the philosophy isn't there. If people are of the mindset, a leader is going to force people to get on the bus instead of building actual support. There could be very different thought processes surrounding the same piece of paper, right? And it's not the piece of paper that makes it a powerful methodology, right?
Well, you had Art on a few weeks ago talking about it, and I think he was
Art Smalley for people.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
and he was quite right. And there are lots of different ways that you don't want to be too, I suppose, restrictive on your A3s. They're a communication tool. They're a way of sharing your thoughts and ideas. So don't be too restrictive about it. The important thing of doing a paper is you might do 2 or 3 of them a year. It's to help you with your dialogue in action. So you should be able to use that process when you're talking normally out in the workplace about a problem. So it's just to make sure that you've got all the steps right, or if it's a bigger paper where you have to get consensus, then you have to put your ideas on paper. But yes, it's a great tool for coaching. It's a great tool for giving people encouragement and confidence. So the real benefit is, how are people coached through it by their manager, and what experience do they have in actually going through the process? Mm-hmm. If you don't have that coaching and support as you do the paper, then you're not really going to learn as deeply. So it's an important pattern, but you'll see that it's built on PDCA, and this is what I talk about. Toyota is really good at setting patterns. They create PDCA as a common set of knowledge, and then they'll build an A3 paper, which is a bit more complex on top of it. They'll build different layers on top of it as they go. So it's if you can build all these patterns, and I might talk more to it later, if you can build them, then you can actually create synergies and get real benefit in your business. I don't think a lot of organisations take the opportunity and get the synergy out of building patterns within their development systems.
Yeah. One other thing we were going to touch on was, I think when it comes to philosophy, the Toyota Way document that you mentioned, and then eventually Jeff Liker's book, The Toyota Way, try to sketch out some of these mindsets or principles. And, the very first thing, I mean, I'm sure it's number one in Jeff Liker's list for a reason, is the idea of making decisions with the long-term perspective in mind, even at the expense of the short term. And so I think of maybe, for example, putting time into building support through Nimiwashi and discussions and dialogue. That takes time, but it's probably the right thing to do, as opposed to a manager who's going to just force people to implement something like that. That's faster, but I don't think that's really sustainable or effective. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate on some of that. And I guess the other comment I'll make, as part of the thought here is, when you talk about lean as an interpretation of Toyota, I think a lot of organizations that would say they're copying Toyota by quote unquote implementing lean. I don't like the word implement. I think a lot of them are still doing this with very much a short-term focus. So it's always puzzling to me. Like, you say, an organization says they're emulating Toyota, but they're not emulating point one, which seems like a really important point in that philosophy, right?
Yeah, so because we're sometimes working with a lot of engineers, they don't connect well with the idea of philosophy. But philosophy actually prepares us for what we don't see and don't yet know. So it's a really good way to deal with the emergent. And that's why it's, when you're doing strategy, it's really good to fall back on and take forward your philosophies. And if we look at the Toyota philosophy, it goes very deep, and they're not afraid to put it out there very clearly. And it probably originates back in the actions and beliefs of Sakichi Toyota. And his spirit, is defined in Toyota publications as always be studious and creative and stay ahead of the times. And this is still a driving force behind Toyota today. If you follow the business paths of Steve Jobs and Sakichi Toyota, there's a lot in parallel there if you have a read about it sometime. But by all accounts, Sakichi was a very confident, flamboyant and prolific inventor. And at around 16, he decided to follow the creed of his father, which was Hotoku thought. And this was devoting himself to nation and society. So when we start to talk about human development, society, this was a full-on dedication and devotion to pushing forward nation and society. And he reflected on this a lot, and the talent he chose to do this in was to be an inventor. and specifically create patents. He decided his most suitable contribution was inventive activities around the power loom. Now, most of us at 15 and 16 don't go into that much thought about our career. But he also took guidance from an English author, Samuel Smiles, and it was a book called Self-Help, which is a really interesting book to read. But it gave you the inventor's mindset, I think. And he also then started from, if anyone's read that book, he started night classes in Patent Monopoly Act, which was just starting to put in place in Japan at the time. And I encourage people, if you get the chance like we did, to visit the Toyota Museum. It's just an amazing contribution he made. You know, I go there every time I go to Japan and still find it hard to get my head around how anyone could be such a prolific inventor. I'm just so taken aback by that in such a short period of time. Now, interestingly, what Sakichi is most remembered for, besides his looms, is his philosophy of judoka, you know, building quality into the process. The other innovation, you know, was that he actually changed the characters within the word judoka to have a secondary meaning. So this is a thing that Toyota still does today, and it confuses a lot of people, and they don't interpret the words correctly. So you could still take the traditional meaning of judoka by reading the characters, but he actually just changed one character in there, and it moved the concept of automation to automation, meaning, you know, automation with a human touch was the way it was phrased. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail here, but the interesting thing is that if you change language, you actually change the workplace as well and the thinking. And Toyota does that all the time today. And they're so subtle sometimes that people don't even realise it in the outside world when they're interpreting it. So the philosophy of judoka is deeply embedded in Toyota, and that's coming into the autonomous vehicles today. You see that Toyota's out there saying, well, we want to actually enhance people's capabilities. We want, you know, autonomous vehicles to work with people and for people together. Whereas you see some other companies saying, well, we're looking at replacing people. You know, we want fully autonomous vehicles. Now, you also see judoka coming into the management systems. The other one that I want to raise, though, that he's not given enough credit for in Toyota, which is really important, is for creating a culture of harmony within this persistent tension of paradox. And I'll explain it this way. Sakichi was a very single-minded inventor. He had over 22 companies by my count, and they weren't successful, all of them. And there was because he'd make a lot of money from his inventions, and then he'd spend it all on the next invention. Because if you remember back to what I said earlier, this was his calling, to be an inventor. It wasn't to be a businessman. You know, he would appoint business managers so that he had time and money to invent. Now, he resigned from one company early on because of a conflict he had with the managers he'd appointed, and the conflict between invention and profit. Now, this again came to a head in 1910 when he was in his mid-40s, and he was forced to resign from the Toyota Loom Works. And he kind of quotes that as he was forced to resign by profit-pursuing managers and the incompatibility between profit and invention. So the story goes, and it's a really interesting story if people want to read it, but he left for America with a broken heart, probably thinking that he might set up business over there. But he returned with a new passion for self-reliance, including a strategy to manage paradox, the paradox of profit and contribution to society through invention. And I still think we have to think about that. And this fits well with a lot of healthcare areas, I think, that how do we manage keeping the cost right with our contribution to society, and how can we be inventive about that? Now, this is a capability that is rather unique, I think, to Toyota, and gaining the synergies that can live within paradox can really propel a business forward. Now, if I generalise a little bit, I see management and leadership thought in the West and a lot of other businesses, even in Japan, wanting one or the other all the time, or some form of trade-off. They never really want either end. And there's a time when people believed that high quality and low cost could not live together.
Right.
They were a paradox. Now, Toyota dealt with this paradox, and they keep dealing with these paradoxes that people don't believe can actually be compatible. And so I think one of the organising skills that Toyota has that is a really good one to try and understand and teach your managers and leaders is how to manage the uncertainty around paradox, keep it alive and keep it in balance. But then again, many managers are not developed in this way, and therefore they find it stressful and unmanageable. So I think if we go back to those concepts, then people can connect with the contribution to society. They can connect to creativity. They can get true understanding of how they can start to move forward, and it becomes something that you can plan and use into the future.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I mean, I'm curious your thoughts. I mean, I hear things, parallels. I don't know, some of what you talk about there makes me think of Elon Musk, of being an inventor versus being a business person. Elon Musk is a brilliant idea person, but it seems like his companies have operational challenges. Elon Musk is one who talked about basically, well, we're going to fully automate the Model 3 line. He seems like more of a mindset of replacing people, even though Tesla reminds customers that this is not a fully self-driving car. It's got driving assist, and sometimes customers don't heed those warnings. But I don't know, maybe history repeats itself in some ways.
We need inventors, though. We need people who are willing to push the boundaries like he does.
Yeah. But back to the idea of helping others in this process. I mean, are there ways, like maybe now as you're working with organizations, as you're still navigating, working with organizations outside of Toyota, if there are certain things that would be taken for granted in Toyota, like long-term focus, and that doesn't exist in a company, have you found ways to try to coach an executive or prod them to, let's say, embrace more long-term thinking? Or that's tough, right?
Yeah, it is. But what I try to do there is I take the A3 upper level, and we do an A3 on top management thinking. So you might get the executive team to start to build a paper around what are their thoughts on the future, what do they think the environment's doing. And so the CEO or the executive then has these papers flowing up to them about what the leadership team is thinking about the future. And this allows them to put their own top management thinking into play as well. So we've got to get more dialogue at the top of organisations rather than decision making. We need to get them to start to build sense making. And so I take them through a process of trying to extract a good top management thinking and get them to reflect a lot more on that. So that's at the leadership team area, is use the A3s and tools in different formats to extract really good outside thinking around where is the business going, what are the environment settings that we'll have to confront. And these things are moving quickly at the moment, and a CEO needs really good input from the people below. Now, we don't see at the top of organisations a lot of this activity because they're getting sucked down into the day-to-day running of businesses. We need to get better organised so that we actually give them the space to actually do a lot more strategic thinking. Now, I understand that part of strategic thinking these days is handling the emergent, but you can put in place a lot of really good development programs to help people handle the emergent, but also think about the long-term philosophy that should be in place for the business to survive long-term.
Mm-hmm. So one other thing I was curious to ask you, differences that you see between Toyota and other companies in Japan. Because one thing that came across to me when I went to Japan for the first time even 5 years ago was a better realization that the Toyota way, or the Toyota business philosophy, is not exactly the same as the typical Japanese business. I'm curious, what are some of your observations or learnings in that regard?
I think they're really good questions that we need to ask ourselves a bit. And so you're dead right. I see the same thing. I see that it's not necessarily connected to the nation's culture. It's a Toyota specific thing, and it's grown out of a few things, I suppose. I would say the gaps that I see between Toyota and other companies, that Toyota is very high in their competency in two domains. One is organising and the other one is developing. You know, why are they exceptional at organising? We can see that because firstly, they run extreme levels of stability. You know, they are very conscious of levelling their systems and stabilising them. They're agile in changing direction and quick to act on the emergent. They bring new technologies to market. They recover from crisis quickly. We don't see that sort of rebound in many companies. On the competency of developing, they are masters in integrating things like paradox. And there's a paradox as well of synchronous flow and sequential flow. Sequential flow is more evident in Western companies. Synchronous flow is a lot more complex. And I think if you look down on the production lines at Toyota, when we were up on that platform, we were overlooking the instrument panel line. And if we look down on that panel line, there were 20 different instrument panels on that line. So there wasn't one the same that I saw when I looked through them. So this is highly customized, synchronous production, which is not normally what we see on a production line. Now, what that means is that the workers have to be very mindful. They have to be really engaged with their work. It's not repetitive at all. Everything's different coming towards them. And that's why we see the team leaders, group leaders so attentive on those lines, because they know it's very dynamic. I think that's another one that we have to work on a lot better. We were, in Toyota in Australia, and I would say similarly in America, we were never as good at designing work to be that synchronous in our own Toyota plants compared to the Japanese plants. I don't know. What are your thoughts? You've seen American plants and Japanese plants. To me, they're very different in Toyota.
Yeah, well, and first off, for clarification, when you say organizing, you're really talking about organizing systems, designing the work and the flow. You're not talking a more limited view, meaning like 5S, visual workplace organization, right? Yeah. No,
I'm not talking about that. You're right. Organizing so a lot of my discussion is at the design level of systems, so not so much at the implementation. Behind Toyota, you have to imagine that there are people who are designing synchronous development systems so that they all integrate and work really well together, so that we're developing managers and that development program connects with the leadership programs, connects into the team member programs. Very integrated type of organising. Now, these guys, because they've mastered sequential and synchronous flow and how to put it together, what I was talking about there about this mindfulness of the workers, it actually delivers a psychological flow, which is like putting the workers in the zone on the line. And we could see that, and I can test that. If I walk down a line, unfortunately, Toyota line in Australia, people would look up and say hi to me, but you wouldn't see that sort of, people looking up on a Toyota production line.
They're what some people might say. They're in the zone. They're in that state of psychological flow. Where in the Toyota plant in San Antonio, you're driving by in the tour tram, and people look up and wave. Which part of me always says, well, in a way, it's a good sign. They're not frantic. The pace of work is calm enough that they can look up for a second and nod their head or wave. But I remember the point you were making in Japan that when the work is well designed, you get in that state of flow. You wouldn't notice the tram coming by. The day goes by much more quickly. I thought that was a really interesting perspective. But back to your question around what I've seen. We saw at Toyota. There was one other supplier. If you remember, there was a woman working in a U-shaped cell, And it was just so perfectly synchronized. And she was in that state of flow. And, one of the things I always try to look for is, how does the work seem easy? Like in a lot of hospitals, the work is not at all designed to be easy or even achievable. And people are just struggling all day long, which is exhausting and has all kinds of human costs. But I've also seen American facilities that are really well done. So I agree with you. This isn't just it's not just a matter of national culture or that certain countries are good at this. I think it comes down to the organization.
And really, that welding of job design and job crafting, the input of the person and the input of the designer of the work. And the group leaders on those lines that we looked over, they were exceptionally good at designing work, and the team members were really good at crafting their own workplace. I think one of the cells we visited in a support company to Toyota or a supplier, one guy was actually dancing around the cell. His foot movements were, it was a dance move as he worked around the cell. I thought, wow, this is amazing. So I think they're really good at organising. I don't know that we, in our Western companies, really understand that sort of level of organising of work. And, it requires a lot of understanding, like you're trying to put out there with your book on, variation and measurement. There has to be an understanding of variation theory to get to that level, routine theory, pattern theory, process theory. And I don't see the maturity of that in organisations out of Toyota. So it's a paradigm shift in thinking to train people in the concept of organising. And only when we do that will we get the stability that we see. Only when we do that will we be able to handle the emergent that comes out of it, and realise that this will free managers up, give them better routines. It will enable them to be more innovative. So here I make the observation that, organising is a lot more chaotic in non-Toyota groups of companies, and the synchronisation between the methodologies seems more random rather than by design. And we have, few processes sometimes to vet what we let into our organisation's development system. People are allowed to bring in, the latest fad, this book, that book, but there's no integrated patterns within those implementations to gain a real synergy. And for that, we see a lot of leadership training that stands alone, and it's not seen as a mode within organising and a pattern within organising. So I challenge people to be a little bit careful about that. And another area, I think there's not a really good understanding of KPIs and the activities around it. And
how so?
Maturity. Well, when you go into a Toyota plant, they have very defined KPI trees. You may not see them on the walls, but they have a really good understanding of all of the KPIs that affect the workplace. And there's hundreds and hundreds of KPIs in those trees, though they may only be using a few at that point in time. What this means is that they can stabilise certain parts of their system and experiment with certain parts and know that they're having a direct effect. Now, therefore, also, we need to start to move in KPI management in the West to being able to be more agile with our KPIs. So we tend to just set targets each year and then go for achieving them. We have to be a lot more agile in setting targets around the KPIs. So the maturity is not there yet to move rapidly through multiple KPIs, solve the problems more quickly, and change direction. Now, why do I say that? If you go really hard at one KPI, the energy level, the closer you get to achieving it, goes up and up and up because you've got more and more work to put into it. At some point in time, if you do get a really good achievement against one KPI, you've got to say 80% is really good. We can, if we move to another KPI now during the year, then we can get, with less effort, just as good an impact. Do you see where I'm getting in that agile of agility of KPIs.
Well, I think of like smaller, faster PDCA cycles instead of an annual chunk of here was the goal. Wait for the year to end. Did you hit the goal? No. React. You could do this more frequently throughout the year and adjust, right?
That's it. Exactly. I like that.
Yeah. Well,
so that's
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go for it. Yes.
Well, I was going to say, sort of final thought, you've talked about organizing. Can you talk more? You saw the blog post that I wrote that was inspired by conversations we had in Japan about Toyota being a development organization. Can we talk a little bit more about what that means as being a strength for Toyota and some other companies?
Well, I'll probably just go back to a little bit of history here as well, if I can. And up until the 1950s, Toyota was running a very cost-plus business model. So it was like every other business. And in the 1950s, they hit a few problems financially. And the president of sales and marketing, Shotaro Kamiya, at the time, he set the rules for splitting the Toyota sales and manufacturing into two different companies. And he was probably the instigator, I'd say, of true TPS, because he set up the financial model. Introducing a new business model requires a new model to make profit. Now, he described the Toyota management as having an overly bullish attitude towards manufacturing, which led to costly inventories. So it's kind of telling us that at the 1950s, Toyota was no different at that point to most other companies in the way they were manufacturing cars. And the rules he put in place required a new way of thinking. And the rules were simple, but included manufacturing could not build more cars than ordered by the sales department. And they had to decrease their employees to a minimum. And he also negotiated a buying price with manufacturing that was currently below cost. So he added, cost pressures that were severe. Now, the only way that these could be achieved was really to mindfully engage the workers in extracting as much waste from the system as possible. Now, where did they look? Of course, they looked to training within industry.
Right, the American
they worked straight on that. And look, I was in Japan, and I was talking about the language, within the Toyota job instruction, which is training within industry. And I said, look, it's a little bit, out of date for today, and it's not the most correct English. And really interestingly, the guy said to me, look, I've got the original copy here. We haven't changed a word in it. And it was really interesting to read those words. And, what I thought was a little bit harsh was probably the way Americans spoke in those days, around their language. But so it was very true to that original training within industry standard. And I don't think that we also use that kind of thinking enough these days to get really good standards and training and development systems in place. But they put a lot of effort into that in the 1950s. And then this was the foundation then of the production system. It was based on a profit model. It was based on that kind of thinking. So when they were training people, and they still do it today, they talk to them about, well, we have a target cost and we have, a target price, and therefore we have to work to that kind of thinking. And this has been expanded over the years into value engineering and value analysis. And more recently, Toyota's added a third one, which is value in innovation. Mm-hmm. Now, in the 60s, they built into the development systems the quality circles. And I saw a few people commenting on their experiences on the blog around, quality circle training about being the development of the team member. And the other really interesting thing I found with Toyota is that their development systems are so built into the workplace, whereas a lot of Western systems are outside the workplace, and the development is seen as a separate event, whereas Toyota is very good at building the actual learning activity very close to work. And of course, after quality circles, we saw the development and implementation of Honsha to get some top-down problems into the workplace as well. So if we take people out of organisations, you have nothing. Nothing happens. So there is a direct relationship between the performance of a business and how the people are trained and developed.
Yeah.
And I think we all agree to that, but we don't actually put the systems in place to achieve it. And, we can all nod our heads and say, yeah, I understand that. But development also, to actually get a competitive advantage, you have to build that internal capability. And when it's a very tacit, practical knowledge, you have to develop your own trainers from within. And that's what Toyota does very well. If you outsource your competitive advantage, then everyone else will have that. So you don't tend to see any outsiders training Toyota team members too often, is what I'd say. But you do see that a lot in external organisations.
Yeah.
Therefore, we don't support development really strongly in a lot of our organisations. So the leader should be really connected to the development system and the development arm of the organisation, because this is where they can intervene and actually change the business and improve the rate of thinking within the business. So we also don't see leadership really connecting solidly to the development arm to achieve their strategies.
Yeah. And I'm reminded at one company, it wasn't Toyota, but one other company we went to on the tour, they were talking about some of their quality circle teams that, I've seen other organizations where the quality circle projects were 6 months long, which I think, well, that's a long time. And one of the companies, I don't have my notes in front of me, if I remember right, some of these quality circles were open for a year or maybe 2 years. And as much as I'm a proponent of developing people and engaging people, I found myself trapped in a little bit of Western thinking of saying, but that's too slow. You've got to solve the problem faster. And I'm like, well, but it's just there's a different approach. And I think you or somebody had pointed out, well, the fact that the quality circle was open and active that long doesn't mean they only solved one thing over the course of that long period. But it's just, I kind of caught myself and like, well, I was framing that differently than I was seeing it as different than it really was, which maybe happens when you're coming in and visiting and observing. Maybe some of that just happens.
Look, I remember that one as well. And the actual quality circle she was talking about was related to dialogue between the different companies or different parts of the company, if I remember, and how they were first building trust and how it took time to build that with the different departments. And so some of those things can take a while. And the other part of it is they were seeing the quality circle as developing them in their dialogue and their communication skills. And sometimes that takes a little bit longer than solving a problem on the shop floor. If I remember, she was doing a quality circle in the administrative support areas. Yeah. Is that the right same one?
Yeah, that was the same thing. But maybe a final thought before we wrap up here. I mean, back to the comparison of Toyota and other companies. If Toyota is a development company in philosophy and practice, how common is that in other Japanese companies from your experience or exposure?
I think it's starting to become a little bit more. It's like in the West where lean is growing to an extent. I'd say you're seeing these concepts being adapted more into the Japanese business system as well. But they also have a very deep, I suppose, connection within their businesses. So they, share profit. They have their networks, and Toyota has all of its preferred supplier networks, its tier 1s, 2s, and 3s. And we also saw how prosperous, say, their tier 1 suppliers were in that electronics firm. They certainly weren't lacking anything at all. So it wasn't a case of, putting hard pressure on your suppliers to cut costs. They were getting plenty for their research and development. I think what I am starting to see a little bit more in the Japanese companies is these more formal development systems. Toyota has its floor management development system on the floor, which is teaching, the management capability of team members and team leaders and group leaders in the area of measures. and the areas that you cover in your book. So it's very much about the areas of process, variations and routines. Now, the more that a manager can take out of their head and put into the workplace and actually make it knowledge in the workplace, the more free time they have to do other things. And I don't think Western businesses and realise this, that they prefer people to come to them, control the knowledge. But if you actually put that knowledge physically through 5S, through visualisation, through standardised work into the workplace, you put, it's like Judoka management. You're actually allowing the person to interact with the information where they need it. It frees up the person as a manager to do lots of other things and move the business forward. So I am confident that that is going to become more important into the future. If we don't develop our people, they won't be able to change with the environments that we're heading into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll see more of that. Hopefully we'll see that in more healthcare organizations and more software companies and other types of settings around the world. But go ahead.
I suppose on that, Mark, though, they're going to need help. They won't know what they don't know. And so we have to see them open up to people coming in and helping them understand those things. And also we need to see people go and benchmark and have a look at what other people are doing. There's lots of people, lots of companies doing great things out there. And, we have to get out there and have a good look around and bring some ideas back to our own businesses and engage the right people.
Yeah. So we're out of time for today. Maybe we can do a future podcast. You talked a little bit early on about the plant closure and the continued development of people and the upskilling, preparing people for future careers. That's a story I'd rather not rush. So maybe we can talk about that some other time.
Excellent. Yep.
If people want to reach out to you or connect with you online through LinkedIn or through Honsha, or if they're in Australia through the Australian AME, how would you recommend people reach out and connect with you?
I've got a little website up there they can tap into if they like. It's Protyponous. It means intelligent patterns. So protyponous.com. So my email address is on there if they've got any further questions or comments about what we had today. But we can also see how they comment on the blog as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll put a link to the webpage in the show notes. Again, how do you spell that? It's
Protyponous.
Nous. Okay.
Yeah, taking a couple of Greek words there, patterns and intelligent.
Okay, there we go. So again, our guest today has been Barry McCarthy, talking about his experiences, I guess, before, during, and after Toyota. Thought-provoking, as always. Really nice to reconnect with you after the tour. And for people who are listening, if you want to go to Japan, Honsha runs a really, really, really great trip. I enjoyed the experience in October. You get a lot of time to talk with people like Barry and the back of buses and over meals and during tours. So Barry, thank you again for all of that. And thank you for being a guest on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been great.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.